Right, so, Wolverine, I guess. First things first, we need a body. With my grave-digging shovel in hand, I dug out this Dark Angels Tactical Squad box from under a bunch of boxes in my parents' shed. Once I brushed away all the cobwebs, I realised that this kit is over 20 years old at the time of filming. So now that I've recovered from that existential crisis, we should probably address the Wolverine in the room. Yes, these are Firstborn Space Marines. For those unaware of the difference, these were essentially the OG Space Marines, before Games Workshop released the Primaris range in 2017. Here you can see them being modelled by my glamorous assistants. One of my 3rd edition Marines I painted back when I was 10, and the first Primaris Marine I painted when I got back into the hobby almost 2 decades later. As you can see, the Primaris Marines are quite a bit larger than their older counterparts, and this carried over into the lore with some physical differences between the two types of Marine. This was all met with some strong opinions, so I'll just leave it at that and say that I thought an older, shorter Marine would be the perfect match for a comics-inspired Wolverine. This might feel a bit strange for those of you who are used to seeing him being portrayed by a huge jacked man, but canonically our 200-year-old short king stands at 5'3" tall. For reference, Deadpool is 6'2", which actually works quite well as the 11-inch height difference is about the same as that between Firstborn and Primaris Marines. Anyway, with that info dump out of the way, we can move on to de-Batman forevering the chest piece by removing this nipple-looking thing. With a torso less visibly cold, I lined up the two pieces and glued them together. Next, I put on these serial killer gloves and mixed up some standard milliput before rolling it into a donut shape in this old lid. I recently watched a video by Marco Frisoni showing how isopropyl alcohol can be used to create a kind of milliput slurry for filling in gaps in the models, so I thought I'd give it a bash. With my mixture created, I used an old brush to apply it into the gaps on the side of the chest piece and the neck area. It didn't work perfectly, but I think with some more practice this could be pretty useful. I've linked to Marco's video in the description below if you'd like to see how this is done by someone who actually knows what they're doing. Moving on, I used my hobby knife to scrape away the bolts on the top of the chest plate. If you wanted to be really comic book accurate, you could also scrape away the skull, but I left it here as skulls are cool and nothing says Warhammer like a bunch of skulls everywhere. Using a hand drill, I drilled a few shallow holes along the chest for bullet holes. Then, going in with my hobby knife, I roughened up the edges of the bullet holes to make them look a bit more realistic. With the torso now ready, I glued the feet to the base, then the torso to the legs in a classic Wolverine hunched over position. The Firstborn squatting legs are often a point of ridicule, but it ended up being just what I wanted for the pose I was going for. Now onto the arms. I looked at a few different options, including the Goliath Gang and World Eater Jackals, before I settled on the Black Templar Neophyte arms. The left arm came from the Black Templars upgrade kit, and the right from the Primaris Crusader squad. I skywalkered the hands off the arms, then attached them to the torso in the come at me bro pose I wanted. I sourced some replacement mitts from Space Marine Devastator squad, specifically these hands which are balled up into angry little fists. I scraped away and filed down these knuckle bits so that the claws could lie down flat against the back of the hands, then attached them to the arms. For the shoulders, I took these shoulder pads from a Scout Squad kill team. I debated for a while whether to give them shoulder pads or not, but ultimately decided that these smaller shoulder pads were a good compromise to preserve Space Marine aesthetic and bulk out the silhouette a bit. With the hands now melted into the arms, I used some sprue goo to fill in some of the holes around the wrist to help better blend the bits together. While that dried, I covered the base in some Warworld Scenic spacing glue, then added some bits of cork for some basic terrain. Once the sprue goo had dried, I shaved down these areas and the hands were finally ready for some claws. Now, there's no shortage of options for where you can get lightning claws from. One of the kits I was strongly considering was the Black Templar's Sword Brethren kit. The posing of the arms was almost perfect, and each hand actually had the correct number of claws straight out of the box. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find these arms for sale separately, so I pivoted to using the Neophyte arms, and the claws themselves were taken from the Legion Terminator Tartaros squad. Obviously, these have one claw too many, so I removed the extra claw from each set so that each hand would be left with 3. I then cut away the extra bit at the base of the claws to shorten them, then sanded down the cut area to smooth it out. Finally, I glued the claws onto the hands and move on to the head. Now for the part I'd been avoiding, creating Wolverine's horn, face, wing things out of green stuff. I combined the yellow and blue parts together, then rolled out a thin little sausage. Place this bit of green stuff over the eyes to act as the top part of the horn, using my fingers and silicone tools to gently attach it to the head and shape it. With that part in place, I made another wee sausage and put this one under the eyes, curving up to join its body. Using a variety of tools and lots of water, I gradually joined the two bits together and inevitably left a lot of unwanted texture all over the combined shape. After much cursing and fiddling, the first shape ended up looking like this, which seemed somewhat passable. I then repeated the process for the other side, trying to get them to look vaguely symmetrical. In hindsight, I think using a green stuff milliput mixture might have been easier to work with and led to a smoother result, but that's something to try another time. Still, I wasn't very happy with all the unwanted bumps and texture I'd created, so in an attempt to smooth some of this out, I applied some milliput all over the green stuff using a silicone tool and water to get it into all the depressed areas. Once that had dried, it could then be sanded down a bit to help smooth it out, which left me with this. It's by no means perfect, but will hopefully look okay once some paint is on it. Speaking of, to start, I primed everything with grey Seer spray to give it a nice bright base to work up from. I then applied a rough base coat of Averland Sunset over the parts of the model which would be yellow. I wanted to get quite a bright yellow finish, and I didn't have any aerial yellow to hand, so I moved straight on to Gitz yellow. This was a disaster. It took layer upon layer of paint to even approach getting uniform coverage, and by that point I'd built up quite a bit of texture which looked pretty terrible. So it was back to the drawing board. I ordered some more paints and tried them out on a test model, eventually setting on Gitz yellow directly over white scar spray. With the backpack consigned for paint stripping in the future, I cut out another one, then lightly resprayed everything with white scar. I was worried about covering up details with too many layers of paint, so the light spray did leave some of the Averland Sunset in the recesses, but I hoped this would just look like shadows when I went to paint over it. Before painting the model proper, I slathered on some Armageddon dust all across the base, making sure to get some onto the boots to help tie the model in with their environment. Once applied, I thought it would be quite tricky to reach some of the areas on the base without accidentally touching the model. I really wanted to minimise the amount of cleaning up I'd have to do with thin yellow paint, so I started with painting the base first. Using the same method as in my Deadpool video, I started with tallow and sand, followed by increasingly lighter dry brushing off tallow and sand and Ushabti bone on its own, and finally Wraithbone. Starting with the deepest parts of the body, I used Abaddon Black to paint the joints of the armour and the sleeves under the shoulder pad. With him looking like a badly painted stormtrooper, I used some white scar to clean up any areas I'd spilled onto, then moved on to giving yellow another go. Having learned my lesson, I decided to just paint yellow on the backpack as a test to see how it turned out, before full sending it across the rest of the model. Making sure I left plenty of time between coats, I slowly built up the yellow with 3 coats of Gitz yellow. It still had a bit of chalky consistency, but I was as happy as I was likely to be with the finish, so I then did the same for the head and body. I experimented with using Lahmian Medium along with Gitz yellow to see if it would help it go on any smoother, but it didn't really seem to make much difference. Right up until I went to paint it, I debated whether to go full comic style and give him a dashing pair of blue budgie smugglers, but in the end I painted the codpiece yellow as well. Returning to Abaddon Black, I painted in the recessed panel on the backpack and the black sections of the helmet, trying real hard not to spill onto any yellow areas. For the guns, I applied a couple of thin coats of Kislev Flesh, aiming to preserve as much of the bulging muscular detail as possible. Moving on to the blue areas, I used Kantor Blue to paint the gloves, shoulder pads, boots, belt, and the wee chest skull. Then, to give the backpack a bit more character, I also applied this blue to some select areas. Back to the main body, I used Rakar Flesh for the Purity Seal's parchment, then followed that up with Mephiston Red for the wax seal. Oh, and I also painted it onto the belt buckle. To help bring out the eyes a bit more, I painted them in Orphan Grey as it provided decent coverage while still being quite bright. At this point, I wasn't super happy with the mask and thought it looked a bit like it had these big old yellow mandible things. So to try and fix this, I coated the parts I neatly painted around previously, all in Abaddon Black. Moving on to metallics, I used Leadbelcher to cover the claws, the belt buckle, and these tubes obscuring his magnificent 8-pack. With those larger bits done, I then also applied Leadbelcher to the bullet holes in his chest and the interface ports on his arm. Lastly, I painted up the metallic areas of the backpack and the helmet. Now that everything was painted somewhat neatly, I went in with some thinned down tallow and sand to make a mess of the legs, giving them the appearance of being caked in dirt from their surroundings. Then, as a final touch, I used Abaddon Black to draw an X onto the belt buckle. I messed this up on the first pass, but after being cleaned up with some Mephiston Red, it looked like this. Onto the shading, Nuln Oil and Lahmian Medium were applied on the metallic areas, including the bullet holes, to add some depth. Pure, undiluted Nuln Oil was then applied to the blue areas, particularly the gloves. For the yellow areas, I experimented with a couple of options on a test model before settling on Reikland Flesh Shade to give a warmer but also kind of worn and dirty appearance. I then also applied this to the bullet holes and then the arms. Lastly, for the purity seal, I used Seraphim Sepia on the parchment, then some Carroburg Crimson was applied to the wax. Inevitably, there was a wee bit of overspill, which I cleaned up before moving on to the edge highlighting. I started with a mix of Kantor Blue and Alaitoc Blue for the blue areas, picking out some of the easier edges to highlight. In hindsight, I think I should have gone for pure Alaitoc Blue for the edges to really pop, but hey ho. Mechanicus Standard Grey was then used to highlight the joints and black parts of the mask, painting all of the upward facing parts of the horns. Phalanx Yellow ended up being quite subtle, so it was used sparingly across the yellow areas before moving on to the purity seal. Here I used Evil Sun Scarlet for the wax seal, then picked out the edges of the parchment with Pallid Witch Flesh. Once that was dry, I added some scribbles onto the purity seal with Abaddon Black. The arms were darkened quite a bit from the Reikland Flesh Shade bath, so I went over them with the original Kislev Flesh, leaving the recesses to retain the shading. Lastly, Stormhost Silver and Lahmian Medium were used to pick out the edges of the claws and other metallics to help them look nice and sharp. With everything fully painted, I removed the head and backpack from their holders, then filed down the contact points so that the glue would act on the plastic, not on the paint. Said superglue was then applied and its various bits were stuck back together. I painted the rim with a couple of coats of Abaddon Black, then coated the entire model with a 50-50 mix of AK Ultramatte varnish and contrast medium. I made sure here to avoid the metallic areas and the shoulder pads, which I wanted to retain their shine. And with that, the Wolverine was finally complete. Thank you so much for watching. This project was not without its challenges. It was the first time I'd properly used yellow on a model, and if I never paint this bloody colour again, it would be too soon. At any rate, I think he turned out alright, and I'm sure Deadpool's happy to have a new friend to play with, which is the main thing. Speaking of our lovable mark, thanks a million to everyone who watched my first video, left a comment and or subscribed. I genuinely thought I'd be lucky to get a couple hundred views, so the response has been incredible. I'm sure most of the exposure was due to the film trending on YouTube, but I'm very grateful to everyone who found the video and gave their time to watch it. Anyway, with us now officially into Spooktober, I'm really excited for the next project I've got lined up. Hope to catch you then.